Welcome to Manor Lords, where over the next roughly 13 minutes, in a short, sweet, but I promise you effective way, I'm going to teach you the basics, the fundamentals, and some tips and tricks around the edges to not just survive in the sometimes challenging world of Manor Lords, but also to thrive. With time cards below, let's roll through. And we'll begin with the basic necessities, the fundamentals, as I look at these homeless people and ponder the need for both food and fuel. If we don't get these, we'll ultimately lose the game. Connecting up a road network and then panning out is my preferred approach. Take a look at the resources you've got, and there are a couple of things to note here. Berry deposits can only be harvested at certain times of year, they are seasonal, and other resources are also replenishable, like wild animals. Iron deposits and other finite resources can be upgraded, but ultimately they will run out. Now, stepping back in, what do we need to do to not just survive, but also hopefully have a hope at growing and leading into combat, and so much more that we'll discuss in this video? Well, the first step should always be a logging camp. Without logs, you won't be able to build, and you'll need them for firewood too. Next up, food. Fast food is probably the best thing to hook up. Wild animals and the seasonal deposits of berries will be your best friends, particularly in the first year. Once buildings are established, you'll need to assign workers, in this case families, to them, and then you'll start to produce the goods. Keep at least one family unassigned so that somebody can handle construction, otherwise nothing will get built. Next up, you might want to secure a longer-term food supply and get things growing and rolling, and that's where the farmhouse comes in. Alongside drawing some plots next to it, make sure you make them nice and big. You'll then be able to grow things like wheat, which will lead you through to flour and ultimately to bread. Keep an eye on the seasonality of the game as well, when crops will grow, when berries won't be available, and when firewood pressure will be doubled in the wintertime. And one more note on these farms, you could also make use of the crop rotation, ensuring you'll have at least a somewhat more efficient and effective growth year on year, and give a high priority to your wheat early on because we've got some issues to solve. These red ones should really be addressed as soon as you possibly can. These are critical errors that could cause a defeat. Granaries, storage houses, and finally, the residential tab, where a free-to-place-down marketplace will allow the families who are working and producing goods to bring them to a central place, distributing them around, of course, to everybody else in the town. This is where your food, your firewood, and everything else needs to be brought. So keep in mind that distance matters here too. People literally have to walk around or horse around. You're going to need time. You'll also need time for growth. Let's talk about growing and some key builds that you'll need to pick up along the way in your journey through Manor Lords. The plots, the residential plots, are the obvious ones to start with. Homeless people are very unhappy. Let's put them in homes. And try if you can to give them extension slot potential. Make them just a little bit bigger so you get this extra icon. That will come in handy later when we go to upgrade them. For the time being though, after they're placed down and built, people will be homed and happy, and of course using the food, firewood that we were talking about before. Keep an eye on your living space, for you won't actually grow and gain new families or population unless you have excess space for them to move into. They're not just going to come here and live on the streets. Approval rating is fundamental here. You need at least 50% approval and you'll gain one family a month. At 75% approval, you'll gain 2 families a month. So that's perhaps the optimum spot to have it, at 75%, balancing off other things like tax rates, which we'll get to a little bit later in this video. As you progress and develop, we'll also cover that shortly, you'll then need to provide the goods to your people. This will allow them to become happier, increasing their approval rating, and that will allow you ultimately to start to upgrade some of their buildings. These extensions that I mentioned earlier are so good, particularly as you move through. You can get people making bread or beer, armor, and eggs, vegetables, you name it. These are really fundamental ways to provide more variety to food sources or new goods. Make sure that you also keep an eye on the requirements up the top here to upgrade and move through to the next settlement level, generally based around certain buildings and progression. And clicking on it will open up the development menu, as well as the policies tab, both of which you can spend, in this case, development points or enact policies to gain all kinds of specialized, rare benefits. Spend a bit of time reading through these. Maybe you're a bread people, you want to go to bread like I did for a more efficient and effective system. Ultimately, it will depend a little bit on your playstyle, and you can't go too wrong. You can go wrong, however, if you don't build these 3 key buildings. The first one is the trading post, and we'll cover off this wonderful bad boy in the next section. Secondly, the church will be required, as well as its upgrade. It's also a useful building for burying bodies. And finally, the manor, where we can enact things like taxes to generate wealth, or choose to give extra food to the church to generate influence. The manor itself is also a defensive building, and as you move through the game, much like you can upgrade the church, but in a much more specialized way through the castle planner, you'll be able to build, grow, and continually develop your manor. These 3 buildings are fundamentally important. Let's return to the first one now, though, as we look to the economy and trade in Manor Lords, your way to get a whole load of cash. You'll need to identify a goods chain, could be sheep, could be iron. In this case, I've got a king pit here, an overwhelmingly generous resource. I've built a mining pit on top of it. Let's get some clay out of here. The next step, of course, in the supply chain is to build the clay furnace, converting clay into clay tiles. Finally, I'll head to my trading post and get a route to sell it. Now, in this case, it's a major route. These are expensive. I need to pay quite a bit of money to establish it, but the prices that it can produce will tend to be much higher. The minor trades above, like stone and planks, you don't generally have much of an upfront cost to establish. You can kind of freely come and go, import, export, potentially both if you like. But the major trades will be also, naturally, pretty beneficial. Trade away any extra goods, and once you're making quite a bit of cash, you might also be able to import things, major goods, like equipment for your dudes, if you haven't yet been able to set up the supply chains to build spears, polearms, and warbows, because that might take a little bit of time. Look through everything. Every single thing. It's a shame I'm not converting this iron yet, but while I'm not able to, I might as well just sell a little bit. Likewise, linen, flax, all of these things that I can use to quickly sell, get a little bit of cash, and then upgrade to better trade routes. Speaking of cash, the treasury up the top right here is our personal money, collected from taxes, and we'll use this to hire mercenaries, diplomatic actions, and to settle new regions. We'll cover all of those things shortly. The second pool of wealth is the regional wealth. This is where your trading money will come from, and also where you'll generate your personal tax. So a more profitable place with more trade and a tax route implemented through the manor will provide you with extra money so that you can go out and expand and do those things that we were talking about before. Trade will be your bestest friend, and you should absolutely embrace it. So much money to be made, and that might be used for combat. Let's turn now to the slightly more aggressive side of Manor Lords. The regrettable side, perhaps. To form your own militia, you'll need both the recruits and the gear to do it. It can be a little difficult at times, especially early on, so you might want to use your wealth that we just talked about generating to hire some mercenaries. You'll pay them from your personal treasury once per month as soon as you've signed the contract. And you'll have these units almost immediately, given the time it takes them to run over to wherever you need them to be. You can use some fairly straightforward commands while in battle and while controlling your units to try and deal with the challenges that Manor Lords will throw at you. It's not just going on the aggressive, but also the defensive. As you can see here, nearby raiders absolutely going ham on my poor people, burning everything down. So I've basically hired the best mercenaries money can buy, and now we're in the fight. The tactical controls here, once you've determined, the kinds of troops that you want to set in, if you have options, because of course the paper, scissors, rock of combat and strategy games plays true here for the most part as well, although unit variety is at this stage somewhat limited. The type of unit, the positioning, and then thirdly I would say the commands that you're giving them will provide your military strategy. Once you're finished on the defensive, you should definitely also go on the offensive. Destroying bandit camps, for example, in nearby regions provides you with a whole load of resource. An incoming message will let you choose if you want to send resources to town or keep it in your treasury, perhaps fueling an infinite wheel or at least a somewhat sustainable wheel of money to pay for more mercenaries to continue to go out and stomp down anybody who might get in your way. It's a very quick and effective way to engage in combat in Manor Lords, and it is, at least early on, my preferred way. It also generates a shite load of influence, as you can see. Just take care to remove the dead bodies through the church and the corpse pit, otherwise your people will be very unhappy with you. Or you could choose to leave. Let's talk about expansion in Manor Lords, the final key part of this video. Once you've generated that influence that we've talked about already, little bit of money as well, probably through the manor, through your economy, and through combat, it's time to expand. You can claim a nearby region that has not yet been claimed, or ultimately empty one out, but then claim it with your influence. The claim will begin, it'll take a little bit of time to play out, and during that time you may or may not get into a little bit of strife if somebody else is vying for that area, or more commonly, you'll probably run into some rogue bandits who aren't happy with you. The next step is to build a settlers camp in the new region that you've hooked up. The settlers camp will come with some fairly rudimentary housing, to be fair, and at this point in the game, the options for the settlement are somewhat limited, though if you have more goods, you can send them more, and that will of course let you build more to begin with. Speaking of begin with, this is basically a new beginning. It's time to get another logging camp. It's time to think about housing, about our animals, and about how we're going to feed ourselves, fuel ourselves into the future. I like to connect up my regions with roads and then go through much of the stuff that we discussed at the start of this video to build an initial thriving economy, and then it's time to connect up to more resources, lather, rinse, repeat, level up, and maybe go out and do a little bit of fighting as well. And finally, to round out the video here, some last tips. At the very beginning of the game, where you'll run into the customization, rename it, choose your dude, choose your shield, choose your coat of arms, I should say, there'll also be a game setup. Initially, I would recommend that you choose potentially the middle scenario, but maybe a relaxing difficulty. Default is also fine. The middle scenario will include combat, the final one on the edge will include a bit more fighting, and the very first one will just be a city builder. So take your pick, choose what's right for you. I'd recommend the middle scenario, maybe on a slightly easier or custom difficulty, just for your first go. And finally, don't forget that little things like upgrading your houses, getting the variety of food or clothing to them, is really beneficial. The brewery extension, for example, was my easiest, quickest way to start to get some of that stuff online. It really is the only effective way. Likewise, your supply chains like wheat need to be monitored constantly, perhaps swapping workers around between the mill and the oven, depending on demand. Thank you so much for joining me in this fairly quick, and I hope very useful, Manor Lords Beginner's Guide. I'll see you next time.